Hi everybody, welcome to the Poetry Vlog podcast edition. This is your host, C.R. Grimmer, and this episode we are bumping up in our lineup. It was originally for season 4, and we're bringing it to you today because it's relevant to online learning. I had the privilege of chatting with my colleague, Davy Knittle from ModPo, and I learned that they have this amazing online teaching resource called ModPo that you can follow through UPenn. So find links to that type of resource in the content description for this episode, and also remember to give them a shout out over on social media. More on that within the episode, and remember to follow us at the Poetry Vlog on Instagram, crgrimmertpv on Twitter, and let us know if this type of transition, meaning content particularly relevant to COVID-19 and online teaching, is helpful, or if you also like to see more of our regularly scheduled programming. I hope you enjoy. More on the episode within it. Remember to give us a review on iTunes if you're listening there, and let us know your thoughts. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Poetry Vlog. This is the podcast edition with your host, C.R. Grimmer. Today we have ModPo with us. ModPo, what do people learn in this episode?
People in this episode learn how to engage with questions of open access online learning and the ways that poetry that might seem difficult or inaccessible provides useful opportunities both to create institutional forms for accessibility and conversations about what access is and how it's made.
Perfect. Thank you. And for folks who are listening in, you can find more about this project at thepoetryvlog.com, wherever you podcast, and over on YouTube. But this is a podcast-only episode as a heads up. And ModPo, where can people go online to find out more about you or join in your efforts or collaborate?
Easiest place would be to just simply type in modpo.org, modpo.org. Perfect.
And are you on social at all, actually?
We are. We're on Twitter at ModPoPenn, Penn, and on Instagram at the same handle, and Facebook as well.
Perfect. And I would encourage everyone who's listening to this episode to go ahead and really go through everything they have there, because I feel like we touched the tip of the iceberg of everything you've generously created. It's pretty awesome. And then if you're listening and you're like, I can't remember that or process it, it'll be typed out and hyperlinked in the description to this podcast. So you're welcome to follow up there. All right. Are you ready for the episode?
Let's do it.
Okay, perfect. I hope you all enjoy. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Poetry Vlog podcast edition. This is your host, C.R. Grimmer, and I have a collaborative guest with us today, ModPo, and Davy and Anna with ModPo. Will you two introduce yourselves and the project?
Sure. So my name's Anna. I'm the overall course coordinator for Modern Contemporary American Poetry, short for ModPo, and which is hosted on the Coursera platform, massive open online course, Coursera platform, and jointly with the Kelly Writers House at the University of Pennsylvania.
And I'm Davy. I'm a PhD candidate in English at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been one of about 10 teaching assistants with ModPo since 2016, so for the most recent 4 years that ModPo has run. And basically what that entails is during the on-season of the 10-week course between September and November, being in dialogue with the 20,000 or so people who take the class every year.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And can you talk a little bit more about ModPo to give the audience some context, and maybe why you think this kind of conversation might be a useful collaborative idea today?
So ModPo is a massive open online course that tries to lend a survey of 20th and 21st century American poetry to like a nice, broad, mostly poetry neophyte audience. We really just want to collect a bunch of people who like to talk about poems. The course runs in, as Davy said, a symposium mode on season for 10 weeks each fall. And we begin with 2 proto-modernist poets of Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, and we march more or less chronologically up to the 21st century and some really recent work by folks like Charles Bernstein, Caroline Bergvall, Christian Book, Kenny Goldsmith, folks like that is kind of where the course ends, Tracy Morris. And we really center the course around these open discussion forums. So we provide filmed collaborative close reading discussions of each poem, and then each poem gets its own discussion forum so that all of the conversation around each poem is totally student driven. So people pop in on these discussion forums and say, wow, I really agreed with what was said in the video about this, or I really disagreed with what was said in the video about that. So the entire mode of conversation in the course is modeled on collaborative close reading, everyone offering an interpretation, asking questions, having conversations just about the poems. And then when the course is not in our on-season, 10 weeks of intensive syllabus work, we just keep the site open. And folks go in if they didn't get a chance to get through something the first time around, they go back. Or we have volunteer teaching assistants and community teaching assistants offer little mini courses on a poet or a group of poems that they like. So the site really remains pretty active throughout the entire calendar year. And then every September we run it back.
Something that's been interesting over the past few years is that we've noted that folks participating in the course are a majority of those folks live outside of the U.S., and many of those folks identify as people with disabilities. And so two conversations that we've been having a bunch is, what does it mean to teach this archive of U.S.-based poetry to a global audience? In what way does it frame or open up a set of conversations about globalization, about the presence of the U.S. as often a really destructive political and economic force? What kinds of conversations can we have with this archive of poetry, and in what way can we open up a vibrant conversation about the failures of this archive and the failures of English as a language and the insufficiency of what the course is built around as a way to draw in students' experiences of what's happening in the course material?
And can you say a little bit more about what you identify as the insufficiency?
Sure. So I think that something that we've been thinking a bunch about is one challenge of this course is that it's poetry taught in English. Some of the poems are thinking about the edges of the English language. Some of the poems think about and engage with multilingualism. But many of the folks who are students in the course are people for whom English is not their first language, and thinking about the necessary insufficiency of teaching monolingual poems to a multilingual audience is a kind of tension that it's been really interesting and productive to have conversations about and to make room for discussions of with our students.
Yeah. And what I like about that is you're bringing together two threads that I think are sometimes talked about as disparate in academic and pedagogy contexts, which is on the one hand, multilingualism, multiculturalism, lots of loaded ramifications that come with those terms, and then accessibility in terms of folks who identify as having disability, right? So the two things kind of converging around what it means to study English language poets predominantly in a U.S. American context to an audience that doesn't necessarily sync up with those identities in the truest sense. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. So I want to talk a little bit more about the accessibility portion. And if I may, I'm thinking a little bit about the experience with the Poetry Vlog project. I've had a sort of similar surprise limit point at times, if that makes sense, where I'm like, okay, I originally designed these videos and podcasts for my students. And at the University of Washington, at least, we have a pretty huge international community, but there isn't a lot of discussion around folks identifying as having disability. And then there's fewer resources for making pedagogical content accessible, but covering the cost for that. So for instance, something as simple as the cost of accurate closed captioning, right? Or thinking about the pacing of the syllabus and the type of turnaround asked for on assignments. So I've been kind of curious about ways to both make sure that the project remains open access without taking a sort of universalist approach. And so it's still free for folks to engage with it beyond the usual university classroom space, while also ensuring that that doesn't mean sort of keeping it to a standardized universal English-speaking American identity, point. And with the poetry vlog, some of the easier parts for that is maybe that we focus so much on social justice poets. It's sort of built in to the type of poetry we're looking at. And what fascinates me with ModPo is that you're pulling it off, looking at what's oftentimes seen as a very exclusive canon in modernism, working up to contemporary. So do you mind talking a little bit more about like how, when you've hit those barriers, you found workarounds, ways that your curriculum has sort of been reshaped or formed in order to respond to the audience needs, thinking about like lots of questions launching at you here, but the kind of way you can meet different audiences where they're at, as opposed to just using it as a tool to bring people into the university. So those types of items.
I mean, those are all like really the key questions that drive our entire project, right? I mean, literally from everything from like, okay, well, access to us in one valence means literally making it free so that no one ever has to pay for ModPo, even as the other massive open online course platforms like Coursera and edX have really moved towards lots of different possible modes for like how to pay for courses. So it means access to me really means that. It means like this is free and will always be free. That's really important to us. And then access in terms of making sure that all of our videos are captioned accurately and cost efficiently. That's been something that we've really had to deal with recently, given the sheer size of our course and of our materials. And then, you know, to some of your other points about like, well, how do we meet students where they are in a manner that is accessible in like the broadest sense of the word? And to me, one of the ways is to really come back to the collaborative close reading mode, right? If the class was structured in a way that was, we have one sort of talking head professor who's lecturing at everyone about what these poems mean, then your students' engagement with the course is necessarily really different. But I think by centering the student-led, conversation-led, discussion-led experience of all the poems, you're making space for language difference and the difference of different coming from different generations and cultures. Like a lot of our students are also older and retired or like haven't done anything sort of traditionally academic in a really long time. They're sort of coming back to an academic environment for the first time in a long time, or they're someone who works in a STEM field and really wants to come into a poetic space. So really centering the discussion as a mode and centering like your individual experience of a poem, right? The poem happens when a poet and a reader meet each other in the poem and make meaning out of it. That to me feels like a really a way to center the accessibility question without always thinking about the sort of institutional version of like accessibility, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does.
Davey, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, something else that we've been doing, so thinking about like what are the material structures of accessibility, but then also what are the sort of theoretical frames of accessibility. And something that has been exciting to do over the past couple of years is to look at the archive and think about disability scholarship that's engaging with Emily Dickinson as a person grappling with ideas of disability, of Gertrude Stein as a person grappling with ideas of disability, of William Carlos Williams later in his life as a person thinking through disability. And what does it mean to take this archive that has been taught as being kind of a monolithic and uninterested in critiques of power, and to think about it as a space where the poems themselves open up a lot of room to talk about access, and that to think about experimental or innovative or poetry grappling with and refusing traditional forms to be in some ways about questions of accessibility, about making room outside of the prose sentence of the narrative text to be able to think about how to dwell differently with language. And Dickinson is the poet who sets us up for a lot of the conversations we have in the course, and to think about Dickinson as someone thematizing neurodivergence and thinking about what's productive and generative of thinking about lots of different ways that people's brains work, and what having lots of different relationships to cognition and information, both emotional and logistical and literary. How that's extremely generative has been really, really wonderful to talk about with participants in the course. And folks have shared quite a bit about their own experiences with disability, about the experiences of loved ones, of students. Lots of folks who take the course are teachers, of their children. And we've both been doing exactly as Anna is saying, trying to produce a logistical framework that's accessible, but also using this, you would refer to it as a social justice focused archive of poetry to identify the ways that it talks about access as baked into the form of what experimental poetry is.
Yeah. And I love that because I'm going to say something I feel like I end up saying every episode, but I guess teaching is just iteration reiterated, right? But because I always find it really fascinating that poetry is identified as one of the least accessible genres, right? But in fact, I think it is the genre that opens up maybe the most capaciously or the most expansively for thinking about different ways of thinking and being in our bodies without having it have to have a single meaning, right? It's not like, well, this is like the main metaphor of this story to tell us this one point in history per se. With poetry, you're kind of working through the different approaches to thinking itself as not necessarily fitting with the form of like subject, verb, object, and here's the larger narrative. And there's something really powerful to me when poetry is used as a teaching tool for encouraging the discussion among different students and folks engaged to identify points where they have a different interpretation or reading of the poem, and that's what's productive about it. Productive might be the wrong word, but that's what makes the experience with poetry unique as opposed to some other genres, perhaps, in ways we can kind of take ownership of reading as part of the making different meanings out of the poem. So I find, for instance, that when teaching, at least, and you can say if it's been the same with ModPo courses, that at the beginning, folks oftentimes feel like poetry is this very exclusive form that's monolithic and inaccessible because you have to decode it for a particular meaning. But something that I found really enriching with doing this kind of community engaged approach to talking through potential meanings in poems and different ways poets are approaching their poems is that students find room to be a little bit more creative in their analysis and see ways that you can have multiple interpretations of a similar object or thing that's doing something in the world. I don't know if it's the same with ModPo or what you noticed in the course progression, which I guess you can speak to if you witnessed that as well.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, a reason why we've chosen poems that are experimental and avant-garde and what we would call open, like a term we use a lot in ModPo is a poem that's open as opposed to closed. We really hope that students, by working through poems that are difficult, find their way into the poem through the process of working through it, right? Like by doing the work of the poem, you're actually kind of finding your way into it more so than in a poem that's, kind of handed to you as a sort of perfect little chestnut that's, immutable and not really available to multiple interpretations, I think that's something that is really important to us when we put together a syllabus or when we put together the kind of poems that we use to extend the ModPo experience into its parallel syllabi. It's really the process of conversation, the process of working through a poem and saying, well, this word could mean this, this, or this. This stanza break could mean this, this, or this. This use of form or intentional non-use of form could mean all of these different things. And it's through that process that I think students start to realize, like, wow, okay, so what's difficult about this is that it's maybe opaque at first, but lends itself to the kind of discussion. And if I'm not sure about something, I just ask Davy. Davy tells me what it is.
Something else that we found generative and productive about the multiple readings is that folks come to ModPo often because they're curious about poetry, because they wish that they had gotten the time to read it and spent 45 years being a lawyer and not having that time. Lots of folks who participate in ModPo, though certainly not all of them, are folks in their 60s and 70s and 80s, which is unusual for an open online course. And many of the folks come to ModPo sort of interested in trying something new and not sure of what it is that they're looking for, and develop intentional and sustained and sustaining forms of community. And something else that's nice about being able to teach that there are multiple readings and maybe an endless set of readings for a particular poem is that it gives folks the opportunity to be in community together, and that the poems are, for many folks in ModPo, an excuse to get to know strangers, that the poems are useful for a course populated expansively by introverts, an opportunity to have something to say to someone that they may never meet in person but may have a many years long correspondence with, and that they're an opportunity for conversation about lots of different scales of ideas, about personal experience, about organization of global power, about ideas of like what the planet is and how it works and changes and everything in between. And that invitation to have like real and substantive and generative conversation with strangers is something that students in the course say keeps them coming back to ModPo year after year.
And actually, that brings me to the question I kept forgetting to ask. First, just for the generalized audience, would you mind clarifying what open access means? And then talk about ways that you also work to make ModPo affordable, basically.
Affordable for us to run or for a student to take?
Well, let's start with for affordable for other folks, and then affordable to run could maybe be the follow-up one. So first thinking about like, what does open access mean? Because I think sometimes I realize I take for granted that maybe academics know what it means, but non-academics might not. So really clarifying what that term means and its importance. And then talking about the cost to participate in open access from the audience perspective. And then maybe from there a little bit the cost of producing open access work in a system sort of designed to make money, if that makes sense.
Sure. So for us, it means that if you go to coursera.org/course/modpo/enroll, and you enter your email address and a name that you'd like to be displayed, that is all that you need to enroll in the course. You do not need to pay for anything. We even offer a certificate that's like a statement of completion, basically. If you write all 4 essays and comment in all of the poem-specific forums and take all the quizzes and, a couple of other little things, we Zach and I actually our tech head of our tech for ModPo, he and I together check all of the folks who say, yes, I want the certificate by hand and do that ourselves and make certificates. It's not the typical Coursera certificate track option, which is paid. Like you can't get a certificate in a Coursera course without paying for it anymore. Didn't used to be the case, but now it is. So all you need to enjoy the course and view any materials and write essays and participate in discussion forums is just an email address and some name to attach to your posts. That's, important, will always be the case. We will never charge anything for ModPo. That means that if you're a teacher and you're interested in using a ModPo video in your class, take it, go. We're very happy that happens. We'd love to hear about it if you're a teacher who's used a ModPo video in your class, because we'd love to hear about your experience and participate in crafting other materials for you if you want. We love it when teachers use ModPo, but we don't expect, any kind of you don't have to be a super active participant in the class or anything like that to use these materials. We literally made a teacher resource center so that anyone who's interested in teaching poetry can just borrow from the work we've already done. Yeah.
Awesome. And then so the flip side of that being, and you can choose not to talk about this today if you don't want to, we've hit 21 minutes. So note that I'll have to maybe cut out that sidebar, but are you willing to talk a bit about how you find ways to fund creating it? Or is that kind of a too big of a digression or stepping on something?
It's a big question. The Writers' House is at the University of Pennsylvania. We're very, very fortunate to be a division of the university that also functions sort of like a nonprofit on our own, where we are very lucky to have lots of really incredible community donors who are really committed to our digital humanities and digital poetries, and are really generous and willing to contribute financially. We use our sort of faculty director has a research fund that sometimes is used for ModPo activities. So we sort of stitch it together through various sources.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of like broader University of Pennsylvania institutional support, that's not a thing for us as much.
Right. Because part of what's fascinating to me about doing these types of projects, and I mean like in the truest sense kind of fascinating, it's a puzzle I can't quite solve, if that makes sense, is on the one hand, like the kind of ongoing and systemic devaluation of teaching, which is seen as also a very like gendered and emotional labor vocation. While at the same time, the need to actually make education open access or free and available to anyone within these institutions that are designed to be businesses, essentially, and make money off of students enrolling to take coursework. So it seems like a sort of ongoing contradiction to find ways to make sustainable open access useful for teaching materials, while at the same time reckoning with why the university itself is inaccessible and so expensive in kind of blunt terms. I'm not saying this because there's like a specific answer to it, but I think it's interesting to find that so many scholars have these creative methods for finding ways to still make it happen, sort of despite those conditions. But at the same time, still are dependent on those institutions to make it happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if we could answer that question, we would all be doing different things with our days.
I'm like fascinating in the truest. Like, I think I'm most interested in the questions where I really don't have an answer. Right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like, like it's just like the kind of ongoing, like to personalize it a bit, because now we're far enough in, I can cut things out if need be. A lot of my friends, with the poetry vlog, it's pretty much just me for the first year, right? And then I added 7 students, I think, total that I've worked with through independent studies to train them to also work. And in the process, the goal is that they have a really significant say in the actual content and design. So it's like, if this is a project built for students, what does it mean to have students who basically have a huge say in and have a lot of working room to create the project itself. And maybe even in the future, my goal would be to move them to the foreground so they're also conducting the videos, right? So thinking about student-centered teaching in kind of the truest sense. But then on the flip side, the kind of responses I'll get when I'm like, well, how do I make sure that the content is student-driven and designed for students while rewarding students beyond just like a credits towards their degree, right? Like, how do I ensure that I can get the course releases to help really teach with the independent studies? And a lot of people's response is like, well, can't you monetize it? Like there's a sort of assumption that the only way to do that is to charge for the thing itself. Oh, we'll just charge like a subscription rate or something like that. And I'm like, but that would be counter to like the sort of central ethos of the educational project. Right. So it's finding like a community where it's like truly collaborative has been a huge part of that. Some of that's been looking at institutions that fund making sure you don't have to charge for it. But some of it's also been thinking about like, what do the students themselves need and how can they be like participants in creating their educational tools? So there's been like a lot of different tracks I think I've taken with it because I'm a much smaller build out than ModPo. But then I've been curious when looking at others. I'm like, wow, this is amazing work. Like I love ModPo's work and what you're doing. So it's been like, how do you sustain it and basically prevent teacher burnout or prevent the kind of ongoing devaluation of the pedagogical elements of research and things like that. And so that's kind of where that question is coming from a bit, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Perfect. Well, we're at 26 minutes. Is there anything, I feel like my brain's really foggy today, so I'm sorry if my questions or ramblings were a little bit discombobulated, but is there anything that we didn't cover that you were like, well, I really wanted to cover this one thing?
No, I think we feel really good.
That that's sort of the end of my conversation with Davy and Anna over at ModPo. Please remember to check our show notes. You can find the links and URLs to all of the different resources we discussed. Davy's amazing work, Anna's amazing work, and of course, the free online courses that ModPo offers and the different modes that they present for your own teaching materials or your own learning experience. This episode might have dropped off a bit abruptly at the end, but basically we wrapped up saying how we realize all these different parts of our projects are in conversation with each other. And I know myself, CR, as the host of this project, would love to hear about other open access, free teaching materials or teaching programs that center these questions of access, imperialism, the canon, interactive learning, all of it. So feel free to reach out at crgrimmer.com or thepoetryvlog.com, or over on social, on Twitter, it's crgrimmertpv, and on Instagram, it's either my Instagram, cr_grimmer, or it's the Poetry Vlog, which is just that with an @ in front of it. All right, I hope you enjoyed this. As always, let us know in the ratings over on iTunes, and have a lovely day.